Please welcome screenwriter Michelle Ashford. There's little Sophia. Welcome, Michelle. I was so excited that you agreed to come. As I mentioned in the introduction, is that this film is it's all about storytelling. Almost all of the characters involved are writers, and they're involved in the operation as writers. Is that something that you find attractive when you agreed to do the screenplay?
Yeah, it was. It was one of the things that I most love about this book. When I first read it, I read it right when it came out in 2009, and Ben McIntyre's book, which I loved. And but the thing that I really was drawn to was the fact that it seemed to be this incredible Valentine to spy stories, because well, as you see, so many people involved in this actual mission. I mean, these are the people that actually do this work for real, and yet they were completely caught up in this romance of spies and what spies were, so much so that many of them were writing their own spy novels. Then, of course, you had Ian Fleming, who became the greatest spy novel writer, you could argue, or one of the greatest, and he's at the center of this. And I realized, oh, it's like this weird Valentine to spy stories, and why they have such a grip on this, on us, and why they have endured for so many years. And I loved that idea. And I had worked with John Madden, and I had really loved Shakespeare in Love, which I felt like was a movie that was about a Valentine to writing. And so I brought this to him, and I said, this sort of reminds me of your other film, Shakespeare in Love, but about spy stories. And he said, okay. And it worked out.
There was another aspect that when I was watching it, I adored, is that when you're telling a story, you want somebody to ultimately believe what you're telling, and that is at the fundamental part of the story, the fact that what they're telling, you want people to get away, to believe, to get away with. Was that something you were conscious when you were writing it?
Well, do you mean the element of deception?
Correct, yeah.
Well, yes, I do. The thing, actually, before I read the book, I read a piece in The New Yorker written by Malcolm Gladwell. And Malcolm Gladwell wasn't really a book review. It was more, in his sort of brilliant way of looking at everything, said, Ben McIntyre's book is about deception, but when you look at deception as a tool in war, is it actually more of a hindrance than it is a help? Because, in fact, when you unleash deception into any kind of operation, deception starts to turn over around and around on itself, so much so that at some point absolutely nobody knows what is true and what isn't anymore. And he was just kind of positing, is deception actually ever a help in things like war, or does it become just this, as he says, this wilderness of mirrors where nobody knows? And I found that really, really interesting. And so, yes, that was one of the things I was also really intrigued about writing about.
Well, yeah, I agree that it's about deception, but from my vantage point, it was the effect of the imagination, and that's what I loved about watching the movies. That I don't think I've seen a film where it's all about the effect of the imagination, and during war, how you can channel imagination and use it for a good purpose.
Well, right, yes, exactly. In this case, they were using deception on the side of right. Of course, most tragically, we've seen recently using deception for not on the side of right. But yes, they were writers. That's what obviously really attracted to me. Even in doing their work and their mission, they're essentially sitting around as writers, creating a character, so much so, and all this is true, by the way, that Montague and Jean Leslie started to adopt the personas of Bill and Pam and went around going out at night, writing each other kind of love letters. They completely fell into this fictional relationship that they just started to embody.
Now, when I introduced the film also, I mentioned that we're used to seeing a war movie where it's in the, in the battlefields, and instead we're in basements, in the shadows, watching what's happening. Was that, tell us about navigating that world and how it felt to to research that world.
Right. Well, that was another reason I was really drawn to it. I had worked on the Pacific, and so I had written about, the very active battles. And as you say, most World War II movies, and there are a bazillion of them out there, are quite often, all about the obvious heroes, the story that you see. And so, yes, I love that you got to actually, for a while, sit in the shoes of the people that were doing the actual work and get none of the credit. I mean, this operation was never even supposed to come to light. It was only 50 some odd years later that these records got released and everyone discovered the real true story of what had happened here. So these were people who had, changed the course of the war and essentially got no credit and didn't even think to have any credit. It was, and so I love that idea of telling the story of the unsung heroes when it comes to war stories.
There was another aspect that I found so exciting is the fact that I'm used to thinking of World War II, of sandbags and darkness, and these people are partying.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was actually something I was not entirely aware of, and it's also because you don't see it portrayed. I had never seen it portrayed, and when I started to do the research about what London looked like during the war, and the fact that it was that thing about the flashlights was exactly how people got around. You could have a flashlight, but it had to be pointed at the ground, and then you would come up to buildings and they would be pitch dark. And you would slide in through, one door and then another door and then a curtain, and then all of a sudden the place would be a blaze of activity and lights and shows and theater and dancing and cabaret, and it was crazy how alive London was during the blackout. And yet, if you were flying over it, it looked like it was completely dead.
And the Gargoyle Club.
Yeah, the Gargoyle Club was the actual club where they met. And it's now the Soho House, if anyone wants to go.
You talked about the research and the facts. Were there M15 files that you had access to?
I didn't have access to. Ben McIntyre has written many, many books and now literally has an honorary chair at the National Archives in London, the War Archives. It was the one who got his hands on them, and he has told me many times the files are stacked this high. And he started to read through them, and he was just amazed because they didn't think that they would be released. So what they wrote in these files was incredibly honest about what was going right with the operation and what was going wrong. They weren't edited for posterity because they did not think that they would see the light of day. So that's why, all the stuff that went sideways in this mission, it was written there very candidly.
Mm-hmm. And there is so much minutia and details on the script about, the love letters that are in the pocket, the receipts of the wedding ring, etc. Tell us about navigating that into the story.
Well, in Ben's book, all those details are true. In Ben's book, there's, hundreds more. Ben's book is exhaustive in its research, and so there was all sorts of stuff that I couldn't. I had to. The process of writing this meant taking Ben's book and kind of deconstructing it and trying to just find the cleanest through lines through it, while still keeping some of the great stuff. I mean, there's hilarious, bizarre stuff in that book, some of which did not end up here. But there were so many details, and I just had to somehow, streamline it, I guess is the right word.
And Michelle, I'm glad that you brought up hilarious, because there's so much humor in this movie, and which is unexpected. Can you tell us about?
Well, thank you. I wanted it to be way funnier, and my first draft that I wrote, I mean, I've been working on this, 2009, so I was working on this actively for at least 10 years. And the first draft was a lot more riotous and funny. And the process, though, you know, when I was working with John, I brought John on, and he kept saying, "You do know there's a world war going on in this story, and none of that is funny, and you're having people, you know, slipping on banana peels." And so we kind of had to find a tone that, you know, this is why he was saying this is not exactly like Shakespeare in Love, because the stakes in this, of course, were very, very real. And, you know, people were really, you know, hundreds of thousands of people were dying. And so that's why the humor got brought. But I'm glad you feel that some of it got through. That's great.
Well, because, I mean, in the hardest moments in our life, there's always humor.
Right. Well, as I say, yes, that was one of the things I also really loved. I thought it was hilarious. There was some crazy stuff that went on. And that also I felt like this is sort of an anti-spy love letter to spies, because the spies are not like James Bond. That's the thing. That's what's so funny about it. And they, even the actual spies have this they love the romance of spies, but in fact some of the work they're doing is just, you know, strange and exhausting and just weird. There was a lot of really weird stuff in Ben's book.
And speaking of spies, was it in the original book that Ian Fleming is the narrator and he's so pivotal a figure in the storyline?
No. So Ben did not make Ian Fleming the narrator. But of course, that's a pretty fascinating fact that Ian Fleming was the guy that suggested the idea, because he had read a spy novel that he really liked about a guy dumping a body with fake papers and all this stuff. So I loved that. And then as John and I were working on the story, it became clear that some kind of narration would probably be good. And then I thought, well, and I started looking, and, you know, Fleming wrote Casino Royale, his first book, in, I think, 52. So I thought, well, all that time he was thinking about it, and he was thinking about writing, surely, and he was in this world, and I thought, well, maybe he tried out a story. And so that's when I thought, well, he could be trying out writing a story as he's watching this happen around him about deception. Mm-hmm. And about, you know, how do you end a story when you don't know what the ending is? And, you know, I thought, well, okay, so maybe I wrote his first story that ended up in the trash can.
Tell us about the women in the story, which I love the fact that it is alpha male world that we have seen in World War II movies. All of a sudden, we're seeing two women that are not defined by their relationship to man in the story. You know, can you tell us about Jean and Hester?
Yeah, here's the thing. Women were incredibly active in World War II. Obviously, you know, many men were off fighting, and both in the States and certainly in England, women participated in many, many ways. And Bletchley was just absolutely staffed with women. And so I didn't have to make that up. I think what happens quite often in movies is people just don't focus on that. So all I had to do is just shine a bit more light on what those women were doing during the war, and I didn't have to fudge it. They were doing that work. You know, Jean Leslie was right in the center of it, and Hester was as well, who had worked with Montague for many years. And yeah, they're both smart, formidable women, and all you have to do is just kind of make sure you're just including them in the story, and you don't even have to fake it.
I love Hester. It comes across that she's overseeing almost. Yeah. She's like the emotional overseer of everything that is happening. And the fact that you cast Penelope Wilton, was the main character always slightly older?
Well, in reality, yes, Montague was always a good 15 years older than Jean, or right around there. But the thing that has shifted in this movie from the actual story is Montague, I think Jean was 23, and Montague was in his early 40s. There was still an age difference between the two of them, but they were both of them younger. And this is, of course, the world of Hollywood, which is then you have to cast your movie, and then that leads to things shifting around, and we ended up where we did, which I'm thrilled.
But Penelope's, Hester's role, she was that same age?
Yeah, maybe a little younger. Everybody, yeah, probably everybody was a little bit younger. You know, yeah, I think so.
No, well, she's formidable.
She's wonderful, and she's a very good friend of John's, as is Colin. So one of the things you get when you do a movie with John Madden is you get a fantastic cast, because he's been doing this for many, many years, and he knows everyone.
And did you, when you were writing the script, did you envision Colin Firth?
I didn't at first, but I love him, and I think he's wonderful. I just was looking at more of a 40-year-old when I first wrote it, because that's the age of Montague in the story. But then once John said, well, you know, let's talk to Colin, I thought, And so the whole thing, and I will say this about aging those people up a bit, it makes the story much more poignant. Those are real grown-ups that have had lives, as opposed to certainly with Jean Leslie in the real story, she was 23, and that was a girl who was just giddy about being part of a war effort and didn't have the same kind of a backstory.
Speaking of the humor, the idea that when it's brought up that you need a dead body, and it's like we're in the middle of World War II, and they're having a hard time finding a body, but it needed to be a body that seemed like it was drowned, as opposed to like bullet ridden
or disease or whatever. Yes, so that is all completely true. They really thought the body was going to be the easiest part, and of course it turned out to be incredibly hard. Yes. So all the qualifications, it had to be service age, male, intact, look, you could pass it off as a drowning. And then, you know, coroners, as the guy said, you know, Bentley Purchase says, we don't give away bodies. That's not like something we do. We don't. So it was, I think, let's just put it this way. They did not reveal anything about how they got that body, who that body was, ever, until these records were released. They never spoke of it. And I think it was, you know, I think it made them, I think they all felt it was like, you know, what you have to do in times of war. And I don't think anybody felt great about stealing a body, essentially.
No. But it's so far-fetched, the story, that it's so far-fetched that it's so hard to pull off. And the fact that they had to come up with such a detailed backstory to you know, solidify the lie. Was it hard for you as a writer to find out how much detail, how much minutia we convey to the audience or pull back, et cetera?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it just took a lot of drafts. It took a lot of drafts to get the right amount. As I say, there's just untold details that were left out. So yeah, it was just a function of what's fun to watch in terms of them writing this character, and what just becomes like, all right, already, we don't need to know where he got his underwear, which was in Ben's book, by the way. Yeah, it took time to you want it to be fun and not start to feel like a laundry list.
And was the love triangle, was that part of the original story?
Well, well, here's the thing. Every time that I wanted it to be as factual as it could possibly be. I do a lot of nonfiction stuff, and you always want it to be as absolutely true as it possibly can be. So then but you have to make it a movie or a TV show, and it has to be entertaining. So then you go, well, what could we push that will feel in the spirit of the story? And the thing about the triangle is, so the Montague and Jean Leslie thing was very real. They were doing that. They were going out. They were writing each other letters, as I mentioned. So that was absolutely true. The thing with Chumley was I felt like, and I would run this by Ben McIntyre every time to make sure that we weren't violating the spirit of this story. I said, but I mean, would it be unthinkable that Charles Chumley, being single and kind of an awkward guy, would maybe have been attracted to Jean as well? I mean, it's not, we can't say it didn't happen, right? I mean, Montague was the married one. He was single, and she was right in his orbit. And we said, that doesn't seem like such a stretch that perhaps he had a crush on her as well. And so we can't prove it didn't happen. Let's just put it that way.
Did there was so much that as a watcher, we're like wondering, how come we don't know enough about this? Were you familiar with Operation Mincemeat?
Not at all. And it was a movie based on in the 50s, based on a book that Ewan Montague had written, but it was called The Man Who Never Was. I had never seen it, I'd never heard of it, no. The first I heard of it was this Malcolm Gladwell article, and in the New Yorker. And his movie is, first of all, it's so wildly different, and it has almost very few of these details in it. And so people had heard this story, but it's just such a different tone. And so I think if you maybe grew up in England, you maybe had sort of heard about this, but then I run into English people all the time, and they had no idea that this actually happened. And the reason, I mean, it's a wild, weird story to begin with, but it was really significant in turning around the war. It was a major reason that the Allied forces were able to finally access Europe, which was absolutely locked down under Hitler.
And the aspect, when I introduced the film, I mentioned that we're always used to seeing single heroes. Instead, this is about coming together and working as a team for a higher good. Tell us about latching on to that concept.
Well, again, it felt like the anti-war movie in that way, and it's so true. And I mean, my gosh, I mean, given the time we're living in, the notion that that kind of cooperation, coming together, working together, making things happen, and it's just, to me, it felt like, oh, what a balm after, people thinking that they can do it alone, and they're, incredibly heroic and large and in charge, and they can do it all by themselves, which is...
When you were writing it, did you understand how timely the film was? Even before COVID, the film just feels so timely. Although we're dealing with a historical period,
Yeah.
It feels like now.
Well, I'm glad that it feels that way. I can tell you for sure, 2 years ago, we finished shooting this on March 12th of 2020, and literally the next day, everything just cratered. And, we kept saying, God, how is this gonna, how will this play? I'll tell you what we didn't know on that day was what would be happening right now in Europe. I mean, if someone had said to us, oh, there will be another land war in Europe by the time your movie comes out involving Russia, we would not have believed it. And so that was completely unanticipated by, obviously, almost everyone on Earth. That has been very sobering. I mean, I don't think anyone thought that. I think there's a certain nostalgia around a land war in Europe that was working for this movie, which no longer does, because in fact it's happening exactly right now. And certainly the element of deception, deception is all about whose hands is it in terms of a tool. And certainly in this instance, the Allies used deception to kind of for the side of right, and now we're seeing it being used to obfuscate the truth from, the Russian people and whoever else is being...
Which reminds me of one of the fascinating things about Montague is that he chose strategies that it wasn't that he liked them, but that he felt that the opposite, it would work against the opposition,
Right.
which is an idea that it's just fascinating that, you know, he wasn't behind the strategy, but he understood that the strategy will work against the opposition.
Right. I mean, I wouldn't be a spy for $1 billion. I mean, this notion of thinking this way, you get so twisted up. You honestly, you know, they're anticipating that you're doing this, while you're anticipating that they're doing this, and then are they faking you out? It just makes your head hurt. And yet, this is what these people did all day, every day, which is this constant loop of who's really thinking what, how is this playing, you know, and in fact, are they playing us at the same time? So the information, in fact, we're getting might be exactly as unreliable as the misinformation we're sending their way.
And are you watching now the news about the war in Ukraine and thinking in that way?
Well, that's what I mean about, you know, the disinformation being used against Russians in a massive way. But the other thing that's very interesting about this, so you could get away with deception like this much more easily back then. Now, every pair of eyes has access to and ways to broadcast everything they're seeing to every other pair of eyes. So it's massive deception on a large scale is hard. It's hard.
Well, Michelle, I love your script, and I'm so happy you were
Thank you
here
very
with
much.
us. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for being such a good watcher. Thank you for coming.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.